Hi there. I'm Dr. Karen Wilson, pediatric neuropsychologist and host of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. Today, my guest is Adrianne Meldrum, founder and owner of Made for Math, an all-online math center focused on serving students with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and math learning disabilities. Adrianne has been on the podcast before talking about multisensory math interventions, and she is back to discuss math accommodations. We're discussing everything from schema-based word problems, extended time, math anxiety, when calculators help, and when they can hinder number sense. We are also going to talk about an incredible tool Adrianne developed, a Math Accommodations Generator. You don't want to miss this conversation.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Adrianne, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It feels good to be back.
Yes, thanks so much for being here. I really enjoyed, I re-listened to our last conversation before jumping on this call and realized how much I loved that conversation. We talked about multisensory math programs and how they can help kids who struggle with math and help them connect math concepts and build skills. And I'm definitely going to put a link to that episode in the show notes because I feel like it's a great episode to listen to with this one. And so it just, again, was reliving that experience and saying, oh, I'm so excited she's coming back.
Yes, me too. It was a really good conversation. And I think today's will be equally helpful.
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is, kids are struggling. And we know that. And it can be really hard for parents to witness their children struggling in math. Specifically, we're talking about math today. And you have observed that many parents often feel powerless to do anything to help. And I'd love to, maybe we can start off with, what does it look like when kids struggle with math?
Oh, so many different things. Well, first of all, I believe that behavior is a form of communication. So when your child is struggling, you might see them avoiding the math homework. They might be sliding down their seat underneath the table to hide from you. They might be intentionally starting arguments or remembering that maybe they need to go take a shower or, avoidance behavior like crazy. Or they pick a fight to get out of it because they would rather fight with you than have to face mathematics. So, and you might think your child's just being stubborn or being a stick in the mud, but typically when it's showing up around mathematics, it's more indicative of a wound, a mathematics wound. And I'll send you a link to share in the notes, but we have an article about academic wounding. And let me be clear, teachers are not intentionally hurting your child. They can't control how your child is receiving a message from them. But nevertheless, wounds happen. And so your child might not have the words to put to it, that they were hurt from an experience in mathematics, and now they are labeling themselves, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I can't do that. And you might hear them say these things out loud. I would say the first one where they're avoiding is like level 1. Level 2 would be they're verbalizing more about the frustrations that they're having and calling themselves stupid. And that's usually when parents reach out to us. They're super concerned because they're watching their child crumble from these experiences in mathematics, and they're not really sure what to do, and they're looking for some sort of hope.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you talked about some of these behaviors, because with some of those behaviors, it's not as obvious that there's an underlying struggle with math. Like you said, some kids will say, oh, I just don't like math, or I'm not good at math. And underneath that, there could be a real struggle, because some students who struggle with math have dyscalculia, which is a math disability that seems to be linked to differences in the way the brain is organized and connected in the same way dyslexia is linked to differences in the way the brain is organized. And I think what's important for parents to know is that, kids just don't grow out of dyscalculia, but they can learn strategies to help them. And there are teaching approaches and classroom accommodations that can also help. And, when we talk about some of those behaviors that you see underneath all of that is trouble with number sense, trouble with lining up numbers to solve problems. What are some other things that you see in terms of the difficulties with math?
Yeah, absolutely. So it could be procedural, like they're struggling with the step-by-steps of how math is being taught to them, especially if they have a teacher that's struggling to let go of the way math has been taught historically, right? And it's a lot of memorizing. And if your child struggles with memorization, that's going to be a problem for them to remember the equations or the steps for long division. Those can be problematic. But we also can see there's issues for students with dyslexia. So a lot of kids with dyslexia will struggle with math facts. They can't retrieve them. It's not that they don't know them. They're just not in their brain in a way that is easy for them to go and access. So that can be really problematic. But then with the kids with dyscalculia, we're seeing more issues like with that number sense. They really can't grasp what 1,000 looks like, or maybe even can't feel a sense of time. Like they don't know what 5 minutes feels like. So there's so many different ways you can struggle in mathematics, and the reasons are varied, as you know. It could be any of the things that we've talked about, from dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD could be getting in the way, and even just good old math anxiety could be preventing the performance we're looking for.
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting is that there may be math accommodations that are available that can actually help children who are struggling for the number of different reasons that you described, but parents may be unaware of them. What is going to help, which ties to, their frustration that we talked about in the beginning. What are some important, let's start with, how do you see accommodations for math helping, and what are some important ones that make math easier to learn, access, and do?
Sure. So my mentor, Marilyn Zecker, and I, we've talked a lot about accommodations over the years. And she recently came up with this terminology that I feel like we should use more often in education. So accommodations can fall into two broader categories. There's output, which is usually what we see, like in an IEP or a 504, it would be like calculator use, extra time on a test, letting the student sit closer to the front of the classroom, having a copy of the teacher's notes. That's output. Those are good, but there's so much more we could do on the other side of accommodations, which is input. Input accommodations have more to do with about how we're adjusting the learning so that the student can absorb the information. So that would be like providing manipulatives or doing what we call focus facts, where the student's not learning all their multiplication tables, for example, at once. We're narrowing it down to a certain set of facts and mastering them over a longer period of time. Or providing a student with what's called a near-point reference. We were talking about those step-by-step things that students have to learn, giving them some sort of paper with a visual cue of what the steps are, because some students are not going to be able to remember and pull that out of their long-term memory. So those are the two differences in accommodations. So we could talk about each of those a little bit more, about what kinds of things we might see in an output versus an input. Do you have a preference which one we start with?
Let's start with output, because that's the one that's probably most common. But like you're saying, a lot of times it's not enough to really move the needle for kids. And I love this distinction between the output and input. So
yes,
we can start with what is probably most familiar to people, and then we'll move to the input.
Okay, so output accommodations are more like one popular one that I see a lot in reports, and you've probably written them in reports too. So this isn't bad. It just is. It's just a recommendation, but that calculator use. Putting that in a report would be, or in an IEP or a 504, would be appropriate for an older student. But I would not give that recommendation to a younger student. There comes a certain point around late middle school that, yeah, we would want to put that in there. But if they're, seventh grade and under, I would say don't recommend a calculator because we're hindering their number sense. Number sense can still be taught at the older grades. Don't misunderstand me. I want it to be taught up there. But yes, give them a calculator so that they can thrive in the classroom situation. Another example of calculator use would be to make sure to provide one in tests. You might see that one written into reports. So that's common and that's good. Let's do that. Let's keep doing that. Extra time on tests. Absolutely. Give kids time and a half is pretty typical. And so giving them that extra time allows the student who's more anxious or has slower processing speed the time they need to get the information out onto that piece of paper. Another one that's kind of interesting is letting them test in a more neutral environment. So instead of being in the classroom, it could be taking the test down the hallway or in the school counselor's office, somewhere different, because you, again, never know how a student is perceiving the environment going around them. And so that can be really difficult. So if they get more anxious because people are turning in the tests before them, a simple solution would be let's have them take it in a different environment to see if that lowers the anxiety, which should increase them being able to show what they know. So those are some traditional output things. Copies of the teacher's notes is another really popular one. And letting the students sit up front. And let's see, there's probably, this one is, well, it's input and output. Using bigger font. That's a really easy one. And the reason why outputs are so popular in reports is because they're fairly easy to implement. This one's easy too. So using a bigger font, bigger than 12. So we want to do like 14, 16 size font for these students and provide lots of white space. So no more than 3 or 4 problems per page. And I know I know schools have rules around copies, but when it comes to a student that learns differently, that should go out the window. They should have the opportunity to have more space to write. It's really important for them. So those are some of the more easy output things that we see in reports. But the last one I mentioned isn't as common, but it could be. That's an easy one to put in that really can have an impact on a student. And that would be for homework or tests. That would be an appropriate accommodation.
Wonderful. Those are really great and very familiar. How about the input?
The input. Yes, this is my favorite. Okay, so in my mind, I kind of put them into little buckets. So we'll share the buckets. So the first bucket would be that procedural, the step-by-step, how we're going to input information in there. So I mentioned earlier, providing a student with a near-point reference. But this, while it could be the teacher's notes, that might not be as helpful to a student that needs more visual support. So a near-point reference that has a graphic organizer or buttons is another example. So a popular one that we give students is one for long division, and it has long division buttons on it. And it has circles with the symbols inside for each step with a very short, snappy phrase on the side that reminds them what each step means. And that way the student can take their non-dominant hand and put their finger on a button while they're doing the work on the other side. So that's really helpful and a really good example of an input that helps them adjust how they're learning. Other things that you could do would be working on the language side of helping them remember procedures. So another popular one we would do, if we imagine in your mind, this is tricky because we're doing an audio podcast, but if we're doing a 3-digit addition, a popular thing we teach our students, because this helps them remember, is short, snappy phrases, but we say, circle the sign, follow the line, and you follow the line all the way over to the right. And this is where we begin. So the kids get used to saying, circle the sign, follow the line. This is where we begin. Because procedurally, that kind of addition doesn't follow reading rules. and so we're working right to left, right? So having those kinds of accommodations put into the report that we're going to be using near point references, short and snappy language to help students recall can be really, really helpful. And when we focus on those kinds of accommodations, the goal should be These are going to help them to count. It's going to help them sequence and apply mathematical procedures. So for an older student, it would be giving them a near-point reference with some of the formulas on there and reminders how to do that. Maybe they're color-coded so that they can remember which numbers are what. Because let's be honest, as an adult, you do not have to have those formulas memorized, right? We all are guilty of it. We go to the internet. How do I do this again? So we should let go of the goal of being so heavy on the memorization part and be okay with what we want is a kid to know how to do the procedures so that they can apply this knowledge and put things into an equation. So that's one bucket, the procedural step. Those are things that you could do. The next bucket that I like to think of is more the verbal part. So this is maybe math fact retrieval if we're talking about kids with dyslexia, and the language of mathematics. So focus facts, I mentioned those earlier. That's a great accommodation to put in. So what I mean by that is instead of requiring a student to have all of their math facts within 100 or something like that, addition facts with 100 memorized, or being able to proficiently use those things, or multiplication, the language would be more that we would use focus facts and that these would be applied through all of their work. So if a student's working on, let's say, their 6 times tables, they're not going to do all the way from 6 times 1 up to 6 times 9. We would narrow it down to maybe up to 6 times 4. And then in our worksheets, now this is, teachers, I know this is hard buy-in for you. I get it. It would be best if the student's focusing on these math facts, but let's say you're in class working on fractions, everything revolves around 4 times 6 for the student. So that we're getting continual practice, but you don't have to wait for the student to master math facts altogether. You can work on current content with your student, but they're working on these focus facts at the same time. So that's what we mean when we say focus facts, is it's focused over a long period of time, and then we add it in. That seems to be really, really helpful for a lot of our students. The other piece of a verbal accommodation that's important is to use really explicit, consistent, and detailed language. So you could put an accommodation in place that the student has an opportunity to learn the etymology of the words in mathematics. And etymology is the study of the prefixes, suffixes, roots. That can be really helpful for a student. So if we're learning about the word fraction, we can talk about how fract means to break. And the ION part is a state or condition or action. And so basically fraction means we are breaking something. And so that helps the student understand what's going on with that word, and they won't forget what it means. And it's abstract to them because we can relate it to having a fractured bone, in fracture like breaking the law. Those things helps the student remember, oh, we're breaking something. And I'll send you this link too, but we have some etymology videos if teachers want to see what kinds of things we're talking about, or parents. But the language is huge. It's really, really important to use explicit, consistent, and detailed language. And then the last bucket I would say is semantic. So these are accommodations that are focused on like the visual spatial part of mathematics. And it's focusing more on bigger conceptual concepts like place value, patterns, number sense. And so it's asking for students to be able to decompose numbers and use manipulatives and help them understand that magnitude. So those things are really important. That's where you would see a recommendation in your report for lots of hands-on mathematics. Again, tying it with it's explicit though. It's explicitly taught in a sequential way. It's not just random, like here's some count, good luck. That's not what we mean. We mean it's systematic and you're working with the student with manipulatives. So those kinds of accommodations can be really, really helpful. But the last thing that you could put in there for an accommodation would be around math anxiety. We already talked about more time on tests and that's testing space. But for informal testing, you could request that it's more game-like based, especially for younger students. if they're feeling anxious, they can't show you what they know, but if they can do an informal assessment and play games with you, they can show you what they know. And then one easy accommodation that doesn't even need to be put in a report, but all teachers could do this, and it would be so easy. When you give a math test, on the very last page on the back, draw some sort of doodle. And the rule would be no one in the classroom is allowed to get up and go turn on their test. Everyone stays in their seat. And when you're done, you flip it over to the back and you draw into that doodle. And that helps other students who have math anxiety not be so focused on people are finishing before me and feel anxious that they aren't done, because everyone's sitting in their seat still drawing and they have no idea if the student's still working or if they're drawing a picture. So that's a really easy accommodation that you don't have to put in a report, but you could put into place that would serve all students, not just those struggling.
Hey friends, it's Karen Wilson. We're taking a quick break to make sure that you know that I'm opening up opportunities to hop on a 45-minute one-on-one Zoom with me for a consultation about your child. I do this work to provide information and tools to parents so that they can better understand their kids, feel equipped to support them at home, and advocate for them at school. Last year, I met with TJ and he emailed me after our consultation and wrote, "I appreciate the recommendations along with the resources you provided. Really, I can't thank you enough. I believe you've set me on the path I've been looking for." Another parent said he was relaying what I said to some other parents at his kid's school, which is completely fine with me. So if you're interested in hopping on a Zoom with me, go to www.childnexus.com/consultation, and we'll set up a time to talk. Now back to the podcast. And those buckets for accommodations make so much sense, particularly as I think about the fact that there are differences in the way that kids struggle with math. And you've got these accommodations that address those specific struggles. You've got the procedural accommodations, verbal, semantic, and even those that target math anxiety. It just makes a lot of sense to break it apart this way and connect it to the student's struggles and how we can provide additional support in the classroom setting, whether it be math anxiety, whether it be difficulties with the understanding of place value, or understanding word problems, math when it's in the form of a word problem as opposed to a calculation format.
Yes. And speaking specifically to word problems, you could request that any kind of instruction with word problems be schema-based, because there is a lot of evidence that says word problems that are taught in a schema format, which means there's like underlying patterns to the word problems. And when a student's taught that way, they learn more. So schema-based is actually really helpful. And funny thing, we had a parent recently ask us specifically at Made for Math, do you guys have a schema-based curriculum for teaching word problems? And I was so happy. Like, I've never had a parent ask me that. That's a very informed parent. And so yes, we do. But you can get an idea of what that is for the educators that are listening over at the What Works Clearinghouse. There's a lot of evidence for schema-based, and there's lots of different options as far as curriculum goes. But my personal favorite is called COMPS, COMPS, and that is schema-based, and it's pretty straightforward and visual. It helps with the multisensory as well. So just that was a total sidetrack. I couldn't help it. I'm excited about that. So parents are like getting really savvy. That's so awesome. And so don't be afraid to ask.
Yes, I love that as well. And, as you're talking about math anxiety, it made me think of another reason why kids can struggle with math or make a lot of errors. And those are the kids who have attention issues, because they will not see the sign. They will add when they're supposed to subtract when they're supposed to add because they're not paying attention to the sign. And then they can leave out steps because of the executive functioning difficulties. Do you have accommodations? Do you think about that really address the attention support that students need?
Yes. There's two things that you could do. Sometimes the student's brain is going so fast. Their brain can't keep up with how fast their hand writes. Depending on the situation, I don't know that I would put this in a report, but supporting that student, allow occasionally for someone to be their scribe. So I've done that with my own boys who process mathematics quite fast. And so to slow them down, I would say, okay, I'm going to be your scribe and I'll let your teacher know that I was your scribe, but that you're doing all the work on the homework. And so I would say, okay, what step would you do first? And they just can verbally talk out loud. And my boys are pacing while they're talking, and I'm just writing down what they say. And I do not correct what they're saying. I let that be up to the teacher. But that does help them slow down and look at the steps and go, okay, I missed this step. Let me tell you what that step is. That's really helpful. But as far as like a student working independently, another thing that you could do, especially if we're working with equations, would be like, okay, step one, I'm going to isolate the variable. And so I'm going to, do the inverse piece of this. And so they write that first step and then they draw a big dramatic line across the page. And again, providing lots of space for student allows them to do this. When we give them worksheets that have 30 problems on a page, they don't have enough room for this. And it was unrealistic for them to transfer it from the worksheet to another page. There's a lot of error that can happen. Again, executive function. So anyways, draw a big line in between each step so that they can see like, okay, this step is completed. They need that like moment to help them see, okay, now I got to do the next step. But you also want to give kids with ADHD a compelling reason as to why. Why do we need to show these steps? And so talking about how you are heading towards a mathematics that will get so abstract that you cannot keep track of it in your mind. When you're younger, yes, but as you get older, it's going to be more difficult for you to keep track of it. And so getting in the habit of writing these things down will help you track where the errors are, but also communicate with others. And some kids will buy into that and some will be, still too uninterested in that. But one fun story I will say is we had a student who had this goal of being a pilot someday. And when you're a pilot, you have to do calculations for loads on the plane. And the co-pilot shows it to the captain and says, here's my calculations. You have to write it out so that he can see, the logic that you had and then provide the feedback to the co-pilot. Like, no, run it again. They're not using a calculator necessarily. They have to show it step by step. So there are situations where mathematics has to be step by step. So finding what is that buy-in for that student, especially when the ADHD is thriving right now and they don't want to slow down for you.
I love that. And it seems like, again, all these accommodations that you've described address so many pain points for students who struggle with math. And when when I'm thinking about accommodations, I'm thinking about adjustments that we make to give children access to what it is that they're learning. And what you've also addressed is that some of these adjustments can ease anxiety for kids who are struggling with math. And I think that some parents will think that when you're asking for these accommodations, that in some way their child is not learning the same as other kids in the classroom. And that's not what you're saying. I think it's important to emphasize that that's not what we're saying.
Yes, absolutely. But like you said earlier, we're increasing access. And, a long time ago, I don't know, early 90s, right? Learning styles was all the rage. And we've learned since that's been debunked. That's not the case. But you could say that maybe with the accommodations I'm recommending are learning style, air quote there. That's not what we're saying. We're increasing access points because some days it might be the language you're using that connects with the student paired with a visual, right? So we're increasing access for the student because the traditional way that they're being taught is not enough access for them. So it's increasing communication with that student and trying to find as many entry points as we can into learning the content.
Right. So they're still learning the same material as others are in the classroom. And then there are also times when modifications need to be made. For example, a student might need to be assigned less homework than their peers or be given different leveled work. When is that appropriate?
I've seen situations where a student with dyslexia, for example, does not need to practice 30 times how to isolate a variable in an equation. Like they get it. It's like slowly painfully dying by math. Instead, it's like assigning them much smaller, much more doable homework. Maybe 5 repetitions of that is all that's needed because of the way it's being taught to them. They can remember it. And as soon as you drag it out, then that becomes, the utility of it is if anyone has a kid with dyslexia, they do not stand for wasted time. Like
Yes.
that is just messy. Like I'm out, they don't want to do any of that. So that is such a boost to them to know that they're not going to have to do 30 repetitions, 5 to 10, plenty for a lot of kids like that. So it's a case-by-case situation where some other kids do need high amounts of repetition. It depends, on your individual student. There isn't, I wouldn't say, a blanket guidance on when is that appropriate, but I think teachers kind of know, and it's something you can test and try out to see how the student does with less homework versus more.
And then there are ways to ensure that conceptually they're understanding, again, that they understand it after the 10 repetitions. They don't need an additional 20.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. This has been really, really helpful for a number of different reasons, because I think when people think about accommodations, often the output accommodations come to mind, but those input accommodations are so important. And then when you further break those accommodations down into these different buckets, procedural, verbal, semantic, and those that address math anxiety and attention issues, it really makes clear how we can better support students who struggle with different aspects of math. And, I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate you coming back. And I know that parents, and I know that other colleagues that I work with are going to want to connect with you to learn more about your multisensory math program and interventions, which again, we'll link to again in the show notes, but also these math accommodations and when they're appropriate and how to, figure out which accommodations are needed. What is the best way for parents to connect with you and other professionals to connect with you?
Absolutely. So if you come to our homepage at madeformath.com, we have actually an accommodations generator to make your job easier. So if you go into our navigation menu, you'll see this cute little gear. And in this drop down, it says accommodations generator, but it's also on the homepage. But what's unique about this is a teacher or a parent could go in and enter in information about the student, about what they're struggling with. And again, we're using the buckets here. So questions that we ask are going to be aimed kind of at, well, are they struggling with procedural things, verbal things, semantic, anxiety, attentional? And then what happens is when you finish filling it out, it will generate a PDF report with the student's name in it and a list of accommodations with the input-output that are helpful. And so it gives you a really nice starting point. You could go through there and decide and highlight which ones you feel like would be worth talking to the school and putting in there, or the educator can decide how realistic that is to put into a student's IEP. And so it's helpful for you in that sense. Many of the accommodations that are listed in there will have links and more information. And this is an ongoing process. We are going to keep updating it as the research changes, but also to make it more user-friendly and easier for educators and parents to get the help that they need. So always come back, check in with us, come see what we are doing. We'll try to share on social too. So that's an easy way to get the latest information, is just to follow us on social. We're on Instagram and Facebook, just at madeformath.com or at Made for Math. And then YouTube is one of the unsung heroes, the account that has a lot of cool information. Go check us out on YouTube. Those are places to keep in touch with us because we'll be updating this information as things change and progress.
Wonderful. And we're going to put links to all of that information in the show notes. We follow you on Instagram. We love your account. There's so much great information that you share, and your website also has great information. And that accommodations generator is spectacular. It is so good. And the PDF is so detailed and so meaningful. And so thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I appreciate you.
You're welcome. It's free. Just FYI, it's free, people. We're not going to charge you for this. We just want to help kids get the help they need.
I love that. Thank you so much, Adrianne. I appreciate you being here and appreciate all the work that you're doing in this space.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Adrianne. Be sure to reach out to her. Her information is in the show notes. Check out her Instagram account and definitely her YouTube channel. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.